Prologue. He looked into the darkness of space, watching as the probe capsule rocketed itself through the void, narrowly, amidst smashing into a nearby asteroid. It was one of millions of ever-endless debris that floated in the vacuum of space, and in an instant, gravitated against the Imperial fleet patrolling the region. Despite the present danger to himself and the crew of the Executor-class Star Destroyer, he felt no fear within. Rather, it was one of the few times you could actually feel somewhat at peace. It was a creeping sensation, something he tried to banish decades ago. Yet, like the most persistent virus, it remained. It was a constant reminder of who he once was but could never be again. No, that part of his life was gone. The person he had once been, the good man inside, had died a long time ago. He shifted his posture, allowing his senses to wander throughout the command bridge of the Star Destroyer. He could feel the crew all around him, could almost see them at their posts, monitoring the local systems for something out of the ordinary. He could detect the frustrations of every single crewman, and some, a slither of what they hoped to find. Yet deeper within each of them, he could feel the fear they all had for him. It was the reminder of who he had become and what he had become.
Lord Vader!
It was Captain Piet. He had sensed him making his approach towards him long before he had spoke. Even now, he knew the man was staring at his right side in fear of what was hidden under the black coat.
What is it, Captain?
Piet hesitated before he spoke. He had heard of what had happened to officers who, for whatever reason the situation presented, displeased Lord Vader, and it made him very much frightened of him. Finally, he coughed to regain his voice, and answered.
The Emperor commands you to make contact with him.
In this instant, Vader spun on his heel and brushed past Piet in a movement that made him catch his breath.
Ensure that I am not disturbed, Captain.
Yes, of course, Lord Vader.
Quickly, Lord Vader made his way to the express lift that would take him directly to the ship's hollow net transmitter chamber. As he worked his way through the halls, ship personnel and stormtroopers clad in their stark white armor all quickly stepped aside and made gestures of salutes. He ignored them. His mind was on what needed to be discussed. He took the lift down several deck levels of the massive 11-mile length of the flagship. At last, he stepped into the chamber. It was a massive room, built for his own personal accommodation. It was, after all, to be used for one purpose anyway. He knelt at the center of the room, bowing his head over like in a submissive prayer. Seconds later, the hologram projectors kicked in.
What is thy bidding, my master?
He raised his head, and there, floating in mid-space, was the head of the Emperor. He in turn raised, or perhaps in this case lowered, his eyes down to his dark disciple kneeling before him. He didn't speak at first, observing him in black armor as his breath echoed ever so loudly in the confined room. Finally, he spoke.
There has been a great disturbance in the Force.
I have felt it.
Indeed he had, and he knew all too well who was at its epicenter.
We have a new enemy. The Apprentice of Skywalker has acquired a student, the young rebel who destroyed the Death Star. I have no doubt that he is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker.
This truly surprised Vader. He had known of the survival of Ahsoka Tano, the old wayward apprentice of Anakin Skywalker, for some time. He had known that the pilot he had encountered in the trench of the Death Star had a powerful connection to the Force, one that was all too familiar to him. He even felt the combined presence of the two on the planet of Corellia. No, that wasn't what surprised him. What did was the fact that the Emperor knew as well.
How is that possible?
Search your feelings, Lord Vader.
The Emperor replied with an arctic smile.
You know it to be true.
He is just a boy, my master.
Vader replied, hiding the growing fear in his voice.
Obi-Wan can no longer help him. There is nothing more the apprentice could teach him.
He had to strain himself not to say her name. He had to focus his will to call her by what the Emperor referred to her as, and it pained him to do so. Unseeingly, the Emperor smiled down at him again.
The Force is strong with him. With a master, he will become powerful. Together, they could destroy us.
If he could be turned,
Vader replied slowly and carefully.
he would become a powerful ally. Perhaps even the apprentice as well.
Yes.
The Emperor strained the vowels of the word all too deliberately.
The son of Skywalker could become a great asset. But it is too late for the apprentice.
Master?
She has become a threat to us, Lord Vader. She is the last remnant of the Jedi, and is proven incorruptible. She must be disposed of, Vader. The son of Skywalker must not become a Jedi.
Vader felt utterly helpless. Old wounds he had buried long ago resurfaced and ate but a rot. His master was right. It was too late for her. There was nothing he could do. He replied at last, bowing his head submissively.
If it is your wish, my master.
I will dispatch an Inquisitor to aid you in this endeavor.
Suddenly, his head rose to face his master.
I do not require assistance in this matter.
I do not doubt your power, Lord Vader, but your history with the apprentice will affect your efforts.
He knew what he meant. The Inquisitor was not meant to aid him, he was meant to watch him, to ensure he would do as he was bidden. The Emperor continued.
I will dispatch Mara Jade.
No, my master, not her.
Not her, my apprentice? And why is that?
She isn't ready for an assignment of this nature.
Is this so?
The Emperor arched an eyebrow down at him. Vader, in this moment, returned the stare, almost in a sign of defiance.
She is no doubt powerful, but she is inexperienced. I require one more suited to the task.
It was a half-truth. Out of all the Inquisitors, she was perhaps the most loyal to the Emperor, and therefore he distrusted her.
Who would you have me send in her stead, then?
Galen Marek.
She woke with a start. She gripped the sheets of her cots with fists so tight they drew white against her orange skin. Sweat poured down her body in droves, soaking her clothes as much as a dive into the ocean. It had been a dream. She couldn't remember what it had been about, but within it, she had felt cold. It wasn't the normal sensation of cold, even with her being on an ice planet made of nothing but snow. She'd been afraid.
Of what?
She questioned herself. There was no response, however, only more silence. She shook her head and turned on the lights of the room. Slowly, the illumination kicked in as she started to dress. Her eyes ran over the dull gray room. She hadn't needed her own quarters, but General Kalisto Rican had insisted on the matter. She would prefer to bunk with the officers. They already mistrusted her because of her abilities. She didn't need them to hate her too. But she shrugged it off. The enlisted respected her enough, especially the older veterans who had served side by side with the Jedi during the Clone Wars. As far as the officers went, her rank of commander gave her a position of authority over most of them. However, she knew from experience and observing the Imperial command hierarchy what mistrust could do within the ranks.
One thing at a time, Snips.
She said to herself as she zipped up the uniform white winter coat. She checked the wrist chron. It was time to check in with her operative anyway. Being halfway across the galaxy made it difficult to keep up with the time lapses, but she had made do to ensure it would work for him. He was, after all, the one buried deep behind enemy lines. She reached into the wall-mounted safe and removed a HoloNet comm unit. She waited a minute for the encrypted call to come through, signaled by a red flasher on the side. When it did, she clicked the receiver. Seconds later, an all-too-familiar face came into view.
Hey, handsome.
She smiled. Rex returned the gesture with his own and a polite nod of the head. Good morning, Commander. Sleep well? Her eyes glanced sideways towards the bed, and she shook her head.
And I thought I told you not to call me that.
She scolded him playfully. He simply nodded. Old habits, ma'am. You know me.
All too well.
Her eyes rolled over the blue hologram's face. It had been a little over 5 years since she recovered the deceased Dr. Uthan's reverse engineer FG-36 virus. Originally developed to kill Fett template clones by targeting their DNA markers, the virus had been altered to slow down their rapid aging process. Rex, it had worked a little too well. Now, he aged slower than even most humans. Rex rubbed his hand through his regulation haircuts. Years prior, he had shaved it, and had grown a beard so massive that even his old comrades in the Torn Company wouldn't have recognized him. However, when he was assigned to be placed undercover within the ranks of the Stormtrooper Corps, he had grown his hair out again. He didn't mind the change in appearance. In some ways, it brought back memories of better times. A time when the enemy had been droids and their Sith masters, and not his fellow brothers. To Ahsoka, the expression was his tell when something was wrong.
Rex, what is it?
Harris, he's dead. Thurlow Harris had been another operative deployed by the Rebellion to garner support, even secretive, from the Inner Rim worlds. Weeks prior, he had disappeared. Rex in turn had been deployed to locate and recover him.
What happened?
Boba Fett. By the time I found him, he was already dead. I later caught up with Fett on Tatooine, but he escaped.
That is rather unorthodox for the Bureau, Rex. Hiring a bounty hunter to track one of our operatives?
I know. I'd expected to counter the ISB, but that's not important.
What do you mean?
Though Fett escaped me, I found out who hired him. It wasn't the Bureau, Ahsoka.
Then who?
Vader. The name stunned her. She thought back years prior to the horrifying moment when she had first encountered the Dark Lord, the moment she had realized the truth about him. It wouldn't be the last time either. She closed her eyes. The faces of the dead, murdered in Vader's quest to hunt her down, haunted her still. As she opened them again, she thought of her apprentice.
Then he knows, doesn't he, Rex?
I don't see any other reason why you'd hire Fett, he replied, his voice grave in the knowledge of the coming storm. We already know he was looking for him after he destroyed the Death Star.
Oh, Luke.
She cried as she buried her face in her hands.
I can't keep lying to him.
There were only 2 people in the Rebellion who knew the truth about Darth Vader, who knew the horrible connection he had to the hero of the Rebellion, now the apprentice to one of the last remaining Jedi in the galaxy. Then it's time, Rex replied, his face lightening as he did. We both knew this day would come one way or another.
But Obi-Wan
Is dead, Ahsoka. I know you've been speaking to him. Right now, we don't have any other choice. Luke needs to know the truth about his father. She didn't respond. Instead, she continued to stare at the floor as though it was alive. Her body was still, but her mind raced with the risk they would have to take. She remembered Corellia, when the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the man she had revered as an uncle of sorts, came to her with a request. He had told her of the son of Anakin, who was on the very same planet they stood on, told her that this Luke Skywalker was perhaps the last hope for the galaxy, that with her teachings, he could become powerful enough to face Vader. But she hadn't cared at the time. She had cursed him for having hid away all these years while the rest of the galaxy burned under the wrath of her former master. She had been one of the founding members of what would one day become the Rebellion. She had fought to break the iron grip of the Empire had on the galaxy. She'd even found fellow Jedi and her oldest friend during those early days. But as their successes grew, so did the wrath of the Empire. Then her mind flashed to her. In the old days, she had been as close as a sister, until one day she drew too close to the dark side and attempted to frame her in the murder of Republic soldiers. It had taken the efforts of her master and an unlikely ally to prove her innocence, but the damage had been done. In her time of need, the Order had abandoned her. So too had she left them. Ironically, it had been what had saved her life. As the galaxy turned on the Order, she'd been far enough away from the worst to survive and hone her abilities. Then years later, that strength had been tested when she encountered her. She couldn't bring herself to say her name, and then the memory came. They had fought, the clash had been bloody, and she had the scars to prove it. But in the end, Ahsoka had come out on top. She had struck the Inquisitor down, yet as she lay dying in her arms, she had given her one last message.
You're looking at your own future. The galaxy has washed its hands of us. You'll never stop hunting you. And you'll end up like me.
Then she closed her eyes one last time. She had been right. It had taken years, but it happened eventually. And in the aftermath, she grew tired of it all. She had had enough. For the second time in her life, she threw away the mantle of the Jedi and hid for nearly 3 years. Then Obi-Wan found her. Then Vader. And then Skywalker. He had saved her life. And in that moment, her heart had melted and she knew what she needed to do. Once more, she took up her sabers and rejoined the rebellion. And in that time, she took Luke under her wing and began to train him in all she had known. Now, years later, she was faced with a choice she didn't know if she could make.
Obi-Wan told me what could happen if I do, Rex.
Ahsoka, you're lying to yourself if you believe that. This drew her eyes to him. I know him, you know him. He has the heart of his father, but the wisdom of Kenobi. She couldn't help but smile at him for the simple knowledge that only Rex knew how to say. It had only been yesterday that Luke had actually managed to match her in telekinetics. She had lifted the T-47, and Luke had to try and move it while she resisted with her applied power. It had taken months, but finally he had grown strong enough to not only hold the massive snow speeder, but to even take control of it and gently place it in the docking clamps on the other side of the room. It had utterly exhausted him to do so, but she knew that after this hurdle, he would only continue to grow.
He's learning faster than I can teach him, Rex. Soon.
She chuckled to herself at the thought.
He might be teaching me a thing or two.
You're selling him a little short, Ahsoka, he replied with a warm grin. He's a Skywalker. Next thing we know, he'll probably be pulling Star Destroyers out of the sky and using them as smash pads. Ahsoka laughed at the image of Luke using an entire 1-mile length warship as basically a baseball bat.
The only balls big enough for that would have to be a bunch of moons.
It was a release. They laughed amongst themselves while paused for nearly a minute until their mouths hurt. They had neither seen nor heard from each other for months, and at that moment, that wasn't likely to happen. Although a considerable number of systems had long since joined the rebellion in the years following the destruction of the Death Star, and more were likely on the way, the galaxy was growing more and more turbulent. Dark years were sure to follow in its wake. The Empire no longer saw the rebellion as just a simple bunch of disobedient children scattered throughout the galaxy. They were organized now, and they were growing, and they were everywhere. Many of the planets secretly backing them or supplying them with top-marked blasters, ships, and even volunteers after seeing that the Empire could be beaten. No, they were no longer just the squabble insurgents. Now, they were an army, and an army with Jedi in tow.
Have you told General Kraken of your discoveries?
No, I wanted to tell you first.
Don't let me stop you, old friend.
She smiled warmly, turning her back to retrieve her twin sabers from her footlocker.
Let me know if you have anything else.
I will. Luke.
I know, Rex.
She closed her eyes and let out a slow sigh before collapsing on the bed.
I will tell him when he is ready.